We got a couple of us from Element here with Dave Calloway, Brennan Hartford from the Committee on Tactical Emergency Casualty Care. Both of them are in the executive committee. And we're going to wade our way through the craziness known as tactical care and see what TECC does compared to TCCC, compared to NTOA and TECC and all that kind of stuff. So right off the bat, what was the evolution of TECC and when did you guys come around?
Dave. Guess that's me. Yeah. So TECC came about formally in 2011, and the evolution had two different prongs. One was purely civilian, working up through grassroots, different organizations, trying to figure out the best way to address high threat response. And then the other was trying to capture these lessons learned from the military. And the idea was, much like TCCC started with Bellamy's data out of Vietnam and then took the operational experience from Mogadishu to create their guidelines, the TECC committee took operational experience from civilian response, but also took the 10 years of war from OIF, OEF, and said, hey, what are the existing best practices on the combat side? What's the data? Let's take this as our starting point and then look at where this applies in the civilian setting, where it doesn't apply, what the gaps are, and then how we can bring this together to actually create a response paradigm that makes sense in the civilian setting.
Now, Dave, you're actually a member of the Committee on Tactical Combat Casualty Care and do some stuff with Defense Health Board too.
Yeah, man. So I was on the TCCC committee for a decade, and then I was on the defense. I still am on the Defense Health Board Trauma and Injury Subcommittee. We just got done doing the formal DoD after action report on OIF and OEF lessons learned in the medical setting.
So when you look at this from this grassroots effort of TECC and then getting into the civilian, what was, if we were going to compare and contrast TECC to Tactical Combat Casualty Care, TC3, which gained a lot of popularity early on in the law enforcement and SWAT side of things, I guess because nothing else was out there. But if you kind of compare contrasts and talk about why TECC is really needed in the operational environment.
Yeah, I mean, so there are a couple things. One is, so TCCC is Tactical Combat Casualty Care. I mean, by definition, your mission is a combat mission. You're going and killing dudes, right? You're finding, securing, whatever, you've got a mission to kill. And in the civilian setting, if you've got casualties in a high-threat environment, it's a rescue mission. I mean, even law enforcement, when they're responding, the whole mission is to protect your community and protect the lives of your civilians in your community. So it's a rescue-based mission. So right off the bat, the mission is different. Then you start looking at how do you get buy-in. In the military, again, you have different branches, you have different services, you have SOF, you have conventional. But if you go in the civilian setting, you've got fire, you've got EMS, you've got ALS, BLS, you've got law enforcement, you've got SWAT. And so you've got all these different communities that have different languages, different paradigms of response. And so what we needed in order to get these best practices in play nationwide was a common language. And we had to figure out how to get all of these different groups bought in on a common language so that we could create this chain of survival where you say, if you're a patrol cop or if you're a SWAT medic or if you're an ER doc, you know the common language that you're putting forth in your community in order to create this chain of survival in a high-threat environment.
So you mentioned the law enforcement and things like that. Is TECC going after any other groups, civilians, teachers, anything like that? Is there any permeation into that?
Yeah, I mean, so in TCCC, the Tactical Combat Casualty Care, the tactical part is, it's military tactics. In the civilian setting, tactics are the mechanisms by which you accomplish a mission. And so when we talk about TECC, we borrowed the concept of the chain of survival. And the first step is the first care provider. And this is what previously was called a bystander, but that's a little bit passive. But the first care provider can be, the marathon runner on scene at the Boston bombing, the, teacher at Virginia Tech, the dude selling popcorn at the Aurora Theater. I mean, these are people who need to be taught certain basic skill sets, mostly on hemorrhage control and how to interact with law enforcement, how to find secure places. But they are the key link, man. And we know this from damage control resuscitation that, once somebody starts to bleed, once they become coagulopathic, it's really hard to save them. So the sooner you stop the bleeding, the sooner you engage in the medical or non-medical first response system, the better mortality is going to be, the more people that are going to live. I mean, we got fire and law enforcement right here, man. What do you guys think?
I agree with what Dave said. With first care providers, with what I do with a large Midwestern law enforcement agency, we're branching out, reaching out to teachers specifically in regards to school shootings. And if we can teach them just some very basic life-saving measures, I think in the next incidents we see coming in this country, we'll have a different outcome as far as lives saved if we could just push those skills down to as many lay people as we can.
From a fire perspective, I think also we see, fire EMS perspective, we see different geographical areas within the United States that are obviously working under different medical directors and different medical authorities, as well as laws within our individual states. And certainly TECC brings a commonality, common language, common treatment modalities to affect the end user, obviously, which is the citizens that we take care of.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at, you asked the original question, or what are the distinctions? The distinctions are, so what's the mission, and then also what's your population? So, TCCC is designed for 18 to 45-year-old, mostly dudes, but women also. But it was designed and studied around that core population. And then, what are your mission restrictions or constraints? And then, how do you get broadest buy-in? Because we know this that. TCCC was deemed one of the top 3 medical inventions of the war, but the other ones are damage control, resuscitation, body armor. And then when we actually look at the data that gets submitted on how many units are actually applying TCCC, the number ain't that high, man. So in combat, if you look at pure TCCC guideline applications, most units aren't doing all of it. And so it's not, TCCC is awesome. I'm a lover, man. I've been involved with it for a decade. I think it's freaking awesome. But you have to look at a group like the Rangers that figured out how do you actually apply it. And if you look at the Ranger data that Cotwall published that said, basically 0 potentially preventable pre-hospital deaths, it wasn't just TCCC. It was TCCC applied in a way that made sense. So they had every single Ranger trained in either familiarization, proficiency, or expertise, but every Ranger knew where they fit in the chain of survival. Every medic knew the job below and above them. They knew the information below and above them. The docs supported both the science and the application. They briefed the command. And then most importantly, the command bought in and said, everybody's going to know it, and it's going to be a common language, and this is a core mission skill. And that's what needs to be applied. That framework needs to be applied in the civilian setting. That's what TECC is allowing.
I got you. So even when we look at TC3, obviously is done a lot to revolutionize the casualty management. In the conflict, especially the conflict that we're in right now, they're an evidence-based guideline. So when they're reviewing evidence, or when you guys were reviewing evidence, a lot of those injuries were on people that had things like body armor, like you brought up, which potentially is going to have a different pathophysiology of issues than the 13-year-old kid in a school that gets shot, or the person at Virginia Tech.
Yeah, I mean, so what I would say is, TCCC's data, some of it is based on the military data side of it is actually observational data, and it's good and it's revolutionary. But most of the supporting data for TCCC now actually comes from the civilian setting, because they took these lessons learned. All the massive transfusion protocols and the damage control resuscitation protocols have been validated in the civilian setting, and that's why they're now valid guidelines. You had revolutionary guys like John Holcomb who said, "Man, I think that this is the right thing to do," and created damage control resuscitation, and then guys like Rasmussen and Eastridge and all these other, big time, Peter Reed, big time leaders who said, we're just going to do it. And then they collected data on it retrospectively, but then they brought it to the civilian trauma centers to prove it on civilian traumas. And that's, from the science standpoint, the prompt trial and the proper trial, these huge trials that have revolutionized civilian medicine, that's where the data is. And so it's a combination of civilian and military data. On the wounding patterns, though, you're right, man. So is there a study out there that shows a cat tourniquet works on a kid? No. I mean, there's a little bit of tourniquet data on kids from Bastion, but we don't know, man. And so part of what the CTECC committee is doing is putting out what's best practice, what we know, but also trying to drive the research towards what we need to know. Because where are the mass casualties going to be? I mean, they're going to be in schools, they're going to be in theaters, and they're going to be kids. And so do we know damage control resuscitation works with kids? No, man. So we think some of it does, but we're trying to push that research. Do we know tourniquets? Do kids get tension pneumothoraces? Is a crike, which is the airway of choice in TCCC, is a crike the airway of choice in a kid? Well, not if you're under 8, because that's what the American Association of Pediatrics and Emergency Medicine guidelines say. You're not going to do a crike in that kid. So trying to come to grips with, where are the differences and where are the similarities is really the core mission right now.
you mentioned some stuff as far as the research looking into some of those things that are specific to the civilian population. What working groups do you guys have going on or actively going on, or where are you looking to move into as far as research?
Working groups, some of the new ones we're looking at, USAR, Technical Rescue. We just created a working group with that. Canine, there's a working group for canine, create guidelines for them. Prolonged field care is one we're looking at.
We also have the group that's working on junctional hemorrhage, huge problem in Afghanistan. But looking at one, how big of a problem is it in the U.S., but also what are the effective strategies. And then one of the psych mitigation group that's been around for about a year and a half working on, how do we build psychological resilience in our first responders and in our community, both before and during and after an event. And then one of the key ones is a pediatric working group that's been driving a lot of the research and the training on this side.
Yeah, and you're even looking at things that are just relatively new in all of medicine, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the more recent ones has to do with Ebola, which again, this is a classic example of you had in 1954 a military doc who tries to do some endovascular occlusion of the aorta for this intra-abdominal hemorrhage. Disappears, comes back, and military docs looking at junctional hemorrhage because of the problems in Afghanistan with complex dismounted blast injury. They come back to this and they say, hey, maybe this is a valid technique. They are able to do a bunch of animal trials funded by the military, but then it goes to the civilian setting, to the civilian trauma centers to get validated and tested, and they get these case series. And so the question then becomes, as a committee, where do we push this out? And this goes to the span of when we talk about the chain of survival. Essentially we're talking about everything before definitive care, which is the OR at a trauma center. And so something like REBOA, which is retrograde endovascular occlusion, balloon occlusion of the aorta, I mean, that's essentially a central line placed in the femoral artery that blocks off the aorta and blocks off blood flow. So it's an internal, similar to cross-clamping of the aorta. So that probably has a role. Do we know where? Well, London Ambulance has done 3 cases in the pre-hospital environment. Is that applicable in the U.S.? I don't know, man. We need to start looking at the data. Is it applicable at first receiving facilities that are not trauma centers, but maybe have a 30-minute critical care air transport time to a trauma center? Probably. And the problem is we don't know the data on how people are dying in active shooter events. We don't have a great consolidation of near-miss data on when people get shot, where they're getting shot. A lot of it's happening not in urban areas, and so we need to have solutions for that.
What about people who kind of signed on with TECC as far as integration? I know there's some DHS and representatives at this last meeting. Are they bought into it, or what's the status on that?
Yeah, man. I mean, so the power of the committee is the components and the members of the committee. I mean, so you've got, Brendan Hartford, and I won't name your agency, but a large metropolitan police agency, Chris Cook. You've got operational leaders from Fairfax and Arlington and California. You've got cops, paramedics, firefighters, physicians, trauma surgeons. That's the power of the committee. But because they've been able to bring together all these different experts, they've got groups like NTOA, the National Tactical Officers Association, who's endorsing these guidelines. You've got International Association of Firefighters. You've got DHS's recent guidance on surviving active shooter and IEDs that specifically says all first responders should be trained in the evidence-based active emergency casualty care guidelines. I mean, when DHS, a federal agency, is starting to say that all first responders should be trained, that's a good, powerful umbrella statement. It is up to the states, it's up to the local departments to do the training, but we started as a grassroots movement. This came from individuals who were riding the rigs, riding the cop cars, and wanted to do the right thing. And they built this up, and now you've got a great grassroots movement, plus you've got the support. I mean, even recently in the American College of Surgeons Hartford Consensus, the last 3 documents they put out have basically restated and supported the TECC guidelines. And this is huge. When the American College of Surgeons is supporting these guidelines, I mean, that's big time. That's awesome.
Yeah, I guess that brings us to the next one is there's so many out there that I think it gets a little confusing on where everybody stands. But so as far as the NTOA and we've done stuff with the NTOA. I know Kevin Gerald, he's a freaking stud. Does he sit on the portion of the committee or?
Yeah, so we've got as they call them, big pipe hitters like Kevin Gerald and Sean McKay that are on the committee. So we tap into people who have been national leaders in tactical EMS, but it's beyond tactical EMS. It's high threat routine operations that, you've got your conventional forces that are showing up on a high threat environment. They need to switch modes of operation from routine call to high threat. So we've got these leaders across all these different agencies, Rancho Cucamonga, that are the people who have been doing the work and really putting these in place. And they're the ones who are shaping these guidelines. Yeah, all I do is help coordinate meetings, bring these people together.
So you brought up Rancho Cucamonga, who I think just like Arlington took a pretty aggressive stance on implementing rescue task force, which kind of brings us into what you mentioned before. I read a document by the IFF, International Association of Firefighters, and National Fire Academy. They both were very pro, obviously, our rescue task force, the implementation of that capability into active shooter events to augment law enforcement. For, I guess, their main focus is getting in there and rapidly treating casualties in a CCP and the rapid evacuation of them. So with that, RTF is I guess, a fairly newer thing to a lot of people. I think it got brought to a lot of firefighters and first responders' attention from IFF position statement, supporting RTF and then supporting TECC as the medical modality or treatment modality as for the RTF. So where do you see the RTFs go? Probably even Chris on that one, man, for fire departments.
I think RTF, actually, the implementation of it is, again, something that seems to be strong pushes on from the locale and individual organizations. There seems to be a little bit of misinformation that gets sent out basically on the tactics and procedures. Obviously, the common denominator is utilizing TECC as the medical treatment modality. But we try to look towards those people, as you mentioned, Rancho Cucamonga, as well as Arlington, for kind of being the pipe hitters in that arena to try to develop appropriate procedures. The problem we run into from a fire perspective is that we all have different concerns based on our labor, what our availability is in attacking rescue task force. And so maybe having some boilerplate guidelines that would be available would be beneficial.
So the whole concept is shrinking the distance of point of injury to first care stabilization and then to definitive care. And so the model that we always talk about is access, assessment, stabilization, and evacuation or extraction. So those are the four components that you have, right? If you're going to take care of a casualty, those are the four things you need to do, no matter where you are. And the evacuation, if you're in a hospital, gets changed to patient movement. But you need to access, assess, stabilize, and then move the patient. And so the question is, how do you most quickly, most effectively do that? RTF is one really effective model. But just like TECC, the application needs to be based upon what resources you have locally. So, the other model is the warm corridor. Our job is not to say, here is what you have to do. It's to say, here are the trauma guidelines for high threat care. And here's how you think about them in a tiered threat environment. It's a direct threat and indirect threat. Now, use your local resources to figure out what makes the most sense so that you can shorten that distance. If you've got a bunch of cops and they're super well trained in medical stuff, maybe the police, law enforcement's the only person who does stuff. If you've got a limited number of law enforcement or it's mostly patrol or you don't have a SWAT team, maybe you do the combined RTF. If you've got other resources and you want to buy a bunch of ballistic vests, maybe that's how you mitigate the threat. There are a bunch of techniques out there for mitigating that threat and shortening the distance. The local leadership is going to be the one who judges the best way to do that.
Dave, I have a question for you. Based on the information that you're providing to us, is there a central repository of information that an administrator that I could actually drive an administrator towards? There's so many national organizations that are kind of springing up. There seems to be a lot of information put out and some of these people are from academia that have some significant credibility. Where do I send a fire administrator or a law enforcement administrator? Which direction do they need to go to?
I mean, the CTECC guidelines and the thought process and the papers are all on the website, and it's www.c-tecc.org. And on there, you can get both the guidelines for the provision of care, but then also recommendations for how you break it down based on your skill set level. So if you're law enforcement, BLS, ALS, you can get that information. And then it also has links to the organizations that have put out endorsements for the guidelines, which are, at this point, a majority of national professional organizations in this field are supporting TECC as a standard of care in high-threat pre-hospital medicine.
Cool.
All right, what was the deal that you talked about before? Because I think there's an interesting difference in some of the I don't want to say guidelines, but philosophies, methodologies, and guidelines that are out there. It was you hit the access, assess, stabilize, and evacuate, extract type of thing. So on access, I think a lot of places out there kind of focus on immediate, threat suppression, where we've seen, a lot of cases we'll go into it here in a second, where access has actually been a problem. But what I wanted to hit on is we kind of focus in on the issues of, let's say, school shooting, theater shooting, things like that. But really, you can apply a lot of these things for day-to-day operations, and not just in a active, violent type of situation. So the cop or the fireman that rolls up on a vehicle accident, still potentially, due to damage to the vehicle, is still going to potentially have an access problem.
Right.
Still going to, I know in South Carolina, in the northern county there, has had like 4 saves with tourniquet utilization at a patrol officer level. I think 3 of those 4 have been on vehicle accidents. So it just kind of shows that TECC really blends itself not just in a violent situation, but potentially on a day-to-day operation of
Right.
Whether they're responding to somebody just fell through a glass table or something and stopping the bleeding also. So it kind of permeates into other tornadoes in Oklahoma.
So that's
all hazards
right.
approach.
So it's an all hazards approach that's hidden on the second and third order benefits of TECC. So, the T in TECC tactics has to do with how you solve the problem. So you guys are fire and law enforcement. I'm a freaking ED doc. We have different tactics for how we address a problem. And so it's not just, the dudes in the black ninja suits, which is conventionally what's been thought of for tactical stuff. That's where a lot of the core knowledge has come from, and frankly, a lot of the core repository of information is going to be in the specialized teams. But what we found, and this is what the Rangers showed again, is that just having super highly trained, medics is not how you successfully save lives. Those people need to be both providers of care, but they need to be team leaders and they need to be trainers, and everybody needs to know what to do. And so then you push this out in the civilian setting, you're like, all right, man, so now we have this paradigm of, access, assess, stabilize, evacuate, and we have this treatment paradigm that says we're going to do different things based on whether we're in a direct threat, meaning the external threats to my life and my casualty's life is greater than the injury, or indirect threat, which just means, I'm in a threatening environment and I need to act fast. So now you have a threat-based paradigm that lets you think about it. And it could be a guy with a gun. It could be a building collapse. It could be the rollover that, the car is not on fire yet, but it's got a gas leak. And so once you train that mindset of thinking about things in a threat-based paradigm and having skill sets that you can apply based on what the threat level is, then you can apply it in your day-to-day operations, or you apply it and shift into high-threat operations seamlessly.
I got you. And I guess one of the things that we see on there that you guys hit is you have something in your guidelines based on being able to have ingress and egress. And so I'll go on a tangent here just because we've been doing stuff on Halligan breaching and things like that. Is for those people that are listening that are law enforcement and things like that, is I guess in TC3, your best medicine was fire superiority was one of the mantras that was out there for a long time, where things shift potentially a little bit because of the environment in the civilian side, where we don't even have the opportunity potentially to employ fire superiority if we can't make access into it. So when we looked at the 27th, September 27, 2006 with Platte Canyon, and 5 days later, the threat evolved, learned from the previous guy, and evolved his tactics, techniques, and procedures, and attacked Nickel Mines, the single-room Amish school. And then 6 months later, we had another evolution with greater efficacy with Cho and Virginia Tech, all evolution of making it real difficult for law enforcement to get in. I think even DHS in their last paper they just put out, that 70-page deal last week, even brought up a scenario of having a denied access for law enforcement to get in, purposely put on by threats. When we look at Nairobi using fire, as area denial. So that's a pretty big part of your guidelines that are different.
Think about it. So what's the point of the statement? The best medicine on the battlefield is fire superiority. The point of that statement is that on the battlefield, the major thing that limits your access and your ability to assess and stabilize a casualty is the enemy laying down suppressive fire or effective fire and preventing you from actually safely taking care of a casualty. So in combat, that's going to be your major barrier to accessing the casualty. In the civilian setting, though, that's not. That may be one of them, but just think about the cases you just talked about. So Virginia Tech padlocking the doors. That's an access issue. You can't do shit until you access the casualty. So you need to be able to breach those doors, either Halligan or car or bust a window or whatever. That needs to be in your mindset, because that's not the first thing in the mindset of a care provider. What about Aurora? The access problem was that there were 1,400 people running out of the theaters, flooding into the parking lot and preventing fire and EMS from actually getting anywhere near the casualties. That's an access problem. Fire superiority, are you going to smoke 1,400 civilians so that you can get to the injured ones? It seems a little bit counterintuitive and perhaps not productive. The whole point, though, is that you need to access. And the historical challenges with like the way that, I'm a physician, right? So I take PHLS, I take ATLS, I take ACLS. All of these assume that I am standing next to the casualty in a climate-controlled, threat-free environment. So start. All right, you're an ACLS guy. Start. You're okay, they're casualty on the bed. I didn't have to put them there. I didn't have to move them there. I didn't have to extract them from a collapsed building or a smoking car. I have immediate access. That's already assumed. That's not the reality in the operational environment. That's where things like breaching, vertical access, things like that matter. But it also matters because how you access a casualty potentially affects how you evacuate or extract it.
No, that's a good point. Just for a side note on there, with Cho, when he was in Norris Hall, he was firing one round every 3.79 to 4.14 seconds that he was in there. But when he was in the classroom, he was firing, one shot every second, with a Glock 19 and Walther P22, one in each hand, firing from left to right in those classrooms, hitting a lot of people. I think out of all 51 that he hit, it was averaged at 3.41 rounds per person. And there was obviously a difficulty because of the 3 breach points with the chains and padlocks. Yeah, and I think what that says is those people that responded there, did what they were the best they could with the training they had. But I think it's important to take in those guidelines and make people aware that when we look at medical, we look at casualty management, that it's a system and there's a lot of processes in that. And if our lane is medical, a lot of doctors, not yourself, of course, but other doctors that sit on there look at it from that lens. And when these things come out, that there may be a more full spectrum approach that's actually going to save lives. Because Joe killed himself as soon as they were able to breach in.
And so you just hit on what I think is the strongest aspect of the Committee on Tactical Emergency Casualty Care, is that, so on the committee we have Plan Cold or TCCC members. We have SOCOM, active duty and retired. We have Special Operations Law Enforcement. We have Patrol. We have Fire, EMS. We have USAR, we have academic docs, we have non-academic, and then we have some international members. So we are able to have these discussions where, my lens, my perspective is as a physician, one with a little operational experience, but mostly a physician. That's different than the guy who's, going on the ladder every single day. And so what we can do is we can throw out our perspectives and with this group, hammer it out to say, okay, what is actually going to make the most sense? And this was the power of the TCCC committee, especially in the early days when it had, a lot of strong operational medic participation. There's no other group in the civilian setting that has that combination of operational, non-medical, civilian, and then also medical professionals that are putting these guidelines together. Doesn't exist.
Awesome. Kind of trying to wind it up a little bit here. This is probably more for Brennan. From a large law enforcement agency, I think a lot of people, as Dave has brought up, may see tactical emergency casualty care is something that they'd want to implement in their SWAT program versus permeate it down. I think you guys have, in your cases, is put an emphasis on trying to get it down to that patrol level, who a lot of times will be that first person on scene versus having a team and whether you're full-time or part-time, those part-time teams out there, probably average a 45-minute time from the pager go off to coordinate that team. Obviously, those guys may be working patrol or narcotics or something else, and they may be able to get there, but they're not there as a coordinated team. So what does that look like from a law enforcement standpoint, or what do you guys envision as far as pushing that down to the patrol level, getting what kind of capabilities, are you focusing on? Agreed.
I mean, most SWAT teams that now have a tactical medical program. Some have previously implemented TCCC. Some are transitioning to TECC or have implemented fully TECC to some extent. And that's kind of taking care of itself, the SWAT teams. Where we need to do is transition, like you said, these skills down to the patrol level, because active shooter situations, not only my personal opinion, but in my agency's opinion, active shooters are not a SWAT response problem, it's a patrol problem. They are going to be the initial responders that deal with the threat. I mean, historically, you look back at these events, if the offender is not self-inflicting and ended a resolution, it's a patrol officer that's going to end the problem. SWAT will be there as a follow-on to clean up and completely search the location, but they're going to be an afterthought. So we need to transition these TEC skills down to the patrol level and, like you mentioned, to the narcotics and gang officers and other ones that are going to be responding to these because they're working on the street all the time. I think most agencies are starting to do that fairly well. And everybody's doing it a little different, but I think the big success, for lack of a better word, for law enforcement is they're getting buy-in from their agencies to see that this is a skill that patrol needs. And everybody's skin in this cat a little different, but basically they're creating a self-aid buddy aid program based on the TECC guidelines to, be able to provide care for themselves, their partners, or injured civilians when they enter these types of environments.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the beauty of that too is, recently when there was a change of guard with the Thames chair for the NTOA, I think that was one of the first things Kevin Gerald put out was a document emphasizing these skill sets get pushed down to a patrol officer, which is
huge.
It's huge, man. For the National Tactical Officer Association to put that in there, I think that was brilliant.
We've also seen actually, in addition with the alert training program too, from a national scale.
Yeah. Good point.
What is the deal with alerts? Because I know they're a big standard that's out there.
Yeah, so the alert program out of Texas State is the FBI's official partner for active shooter training domestically. Great program, great training program. They train thousands of people all over the country in active shooter response.
I think internationally too. I think they've done some stuff internationally out of San Marcos.
Yeah,
Texas.
and they've been a big supporter and an important partner with TECC, and the TECC guidelines are their medical trauma response guidelines that they train as part of their active shooter standard response.
For Alert 2, I think.
For Alert 2,
right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's part. So Alert, and then the different partners. In between, FEMA has allocated somewhere close to $2 million in the last 4 years to train TECC through their technical assistance program, and then through the George Washington grant this year. And with all that in the last 4 years, on the order of 100 to 120,000 first responders and physicians have been trained in tactical emergency casualty care, and so that's patrol, SWAT, ALS, BLS, fire, ED docs, PAs across the country, and
you brought up
almost every state.
You brought up the TA thing. Anybody that wants to can contact DHS, right, and request a TA?
Absolutely. So the FEMA Technical Assistance, the TA program, FEMA puts on these programs where you get on their website, you request a TA. They have all kinds of different ones they can do, hazmat, et cetera, but they have a specific program for TECC, and it's just requested by the agency. FEMA funds it. They fly out instructors. They do a one-day seminar on how to stand up a local TECC program, and we've done probably 12 or 14 of them in the last 2 years.
Dave, this might have already been brought up a little bit originally, but this also kind of permeates on when we talk about first care providers. That kind of falls in line with that, within the mission of what TECC is looking at. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, so we know, and so in the original TECC guideline in 2011, they said that, we said that the first link is the first care provider, and that historically was called a bystander. And what we've said is crowd management and crowd control is complex, especially in a dynamic environment. You have to figure out how to do scene safety, but these people, need to be trained because they're going to be the first ones to access casualty. We saw this in Boston, LAX, man, like no one was in there for 33 minutes or 23 minutes. There were certainly their first care providers standing by who could have been first care providers. In any place where you've got barricade suspect, Aurora, any of these places, properly trained, citizens can be the first care providers, and they can be that first key link in the TECC chain of survival. And they should be. They need to be. Teachers need to be trained. Our communities need to be resilient. And this needs to come from the professional community to be pushed down and supported, but local governments need to support this. They need to make their communities strong and psychologically robust, to be able to handle some of these events.
Yeah, I know from the federal side, I think they're looking at starting their public access hemorrhage control type program for that reason. When we look at Boston, looking at putting a capability right next to AEDs, whether it's in an airport, in a movie theater, and things like that, that have tourniquets, it has hemostatics.
I think that there are multiple ways to skin the cat, and the cat that needs to be skinned is you need to figure out, how everyone's got quick access to provide hemorrhage control in a high threat environment. And that means training your people in improvised care. It means making sure your citizens are trained and empowered to act and feel that it is their responsibility. And then it means giving them a capability, and that capability may be these hemorrhage control kits. I think certainly in high-risk environments or potentially high-threat environments, you should have them there. I think they should be in hospitals, to be honest. If you think about, no one thinks about hospitals because they say, oh, it's a hospital, they're all kind of medical care. You go smoke a bunch of people in the cafeteria in a large hospital area, and, they can put an AED pad on the bleed, or they have to do something improvised and figure out how to get them.
Around hospitals,
right. And it's, I think, again, a lot of this comes down to money, and it comes down to, is the cost worth the mitigation of the relative risk? And I would say the relative cost of these kits is pretty low compared to the potential for life saving.
Right. Yeah, and I think a lot of people fall under that ludic fallacy of like rolling the dice and weighing that out. But you look at nickel mines. I don't think they would have planned on that occurring in 2006 or Littleton or Aurora or any of that also. But you brought up a good point, and it's kind of the last point I want to bring up is I was looking through a bunch of different guidelines specific for the civilian sector, and you brought up improv, which is, in my opinion, like really pretty critical capability because no cop is going to be rolling into these events with 10 tourniquets and hemostatics coming out of their butts and all this kind of kit and aid bags being a regular patrol officer. Where do you feel about improv? You mentioned it in the guidelines. Fairly important because everybody's going to run out of crap, man.
Yeah. So a couple things. One is, so we know that an improvised tourniquet doesn't work as well as an approved commercial tourniquet, but they still work. And the key is you have to understand the concepts of how it works. And when you talk about improvised care, mostly what we're talking about is hemorrhage control. And again, mostly also what we're talking about is either pressure dressings or tourniquets. They can be made, and you just need to know the basic concepts for it. You need to train people to do it, and you need to train people just to think about both situational awareness. So what do you have around you that could be a tourniquet when you're riding in a car, riding a bus, when you're on a plane, when you're in a hospital. There's all kinds of stuff that you can use to create a constricting band, a windlass, and a securing device. You also need to realize that pressure is pretty damn effective. And the problem with pressure in a tactical environment is your hands are out of the situation and you can't do anything with it and you need to do something else. If you've got 10 people, it may be okay that you have one person who's applying pressure for hemorrhage control. And they need to know that that's okay. And so I think improvisation is a natural spin-off of being a student of the game and knowing what the problem is, and then also, more importantly, being empowered to act. Because I think the biggest problem with improvisation is people don't feel empowered to act, so they don't think about how to solve the problem, and then they don't do it.
I agree.
Yeah, you were just involved in teaching an improv TECC at the Midwestern Tactical Officers Association. How do you feel like that was perceived from everybody?
I think it kind of goes in line with what Dave was saying. I think once the providers were empowered to act and realize that they can think outside the conventional medical equipment that they're trained with, I think they rocked it. They actually rose up to the occasion, and for very little money for training, they were actually able to do really good jobs, particularly mitigating hemorrhage and other injuries that would be associated with the use of TECC.
Yeah, I mean, so it's perfect is the enemy of good enough, and the only wrong action is inaction. When you've got somebody bleeding in front of you, the only wrong thing to do is not to act. And, if you put on a tourniquet that's not 100% effective, but it slows the bleeding down enough until I get there and I can put on a real tourniquet because I've got it in my kit, you save the person's life. If you put pressure on it and you slow bleeding so that they lose 250 cc's instead of a liter, it's a big fat deal. That matters. And what the person needs to know is it's okay. You need to act, and it's okay. And I think that that's the hardest thing with non-trained providers and first care providers to get through their head is, man, it's not only okay, it is your responsibility as a citizen in our communities to act. It's your responsibility to act. It's your responsibility to save your neighbor's life. It's your responsibility to save that person's life who's sitting next to you.
Cool.
And the thing I like about the improv and the training for it is it gives you a mindset. And if you can grasp the improv stuff and have that mindset, it will, like Dave and Chris just said, it'll give you and empower you to act. But what it will also do is raise your confidence level that when you do have a commercial tourniquet with you, I got this. This is nothing for me. I've done this with, bed sheets and a broom handle. Now I've got a real tourniquet. Wow, this is easy for me.
Does it also kind of give you a little bit more situational awareness?
Yeah, I agree.
Right, seeing a frame on the wall, breaking it, and it's 4 windlasses.
Exactly.
But really, in your world, the improv, which is potentially, if we look at a PACE, like a primary alternate contingency emergency, maybe an emergency for normal first responders, but with some of your folks in narcotics or UC work, that's going to be the primary potentially.
I agree with that. I like that. I like the improv training for a narcotics officer, and I think that's something, that agencies need to explore.
But also what you said, John, is, and this is what we try to teach all the time, is primary alternate contingency emergency. And so when you train somebody in that mindset, by the time you get to contingency and emergency, you're getting into improv. Right. So if I'm like, my primary is my soft T, my alternate is my CAT, my contingency is my SWAT T, now I need an emergency. Well, so once you train everybody in that mindset, it's easy to say, okay, man, so when you're on SWAT, here's what you got. But you're also running UC. Well, still the same mindset, but now E moves up to P, and you're like, now I got to come up with a bunch of different emergency. My primary is going to be busting out the window or the picture frame, taking a side of it, making the windlass, and I'm going to take a pillowcase, and that's going to be my, okay, but what's going to be my alternate?
Right.
Or what else do I got around here? It's going to be my belt. And then trying those out and testing them, and you start to learn what works and what doesn't, and then how to think around the problem.
Right. And just kind of seeing things different. So you're that guy who's with his family. You're the off-duty cop with his family in Aurora, being able to eliminate that threat and then potentially start acting immediately and treating, which is what's in your environment. Right, just having a kind of game essay. I think it's a good idea too. A lot of people roll around with notebooks or whatever, but wherever you find yourself, even just write down whatever acronym you use, whether it's March or whatever, and you're sitting in an airplane terminal, you're sitting in a cab, or writing March down that list and just looking around you and seeing what would you control massive hemorrhage with, what would you deal with an airway with, what would you deal with, going down that list and finding what it is, even getting to the E on evacuation and cutting carpet around that casualty using it as soft litter or something.
Yeah, you get in that mental game and you start, for anybody who does operational stuff, they know that that's the mindset that you get into regardless of what your operational environment is. You get in the mindset of starting to play the contingency game all the time. And so the trick is to start doing it with trauma care and do it a lot so that, no matter where you are, your mind in the background is starting to actually think through these options.
Cool. All right, well, listen, let's wrap it up. I appreciate your time. And can people get a hold of you through the website, through the CTECC website you get before?
Yep.
Awesome. All right.
www.c-tecc.org.
Group hug.
We're
Drop the mic.
done.